The Roman Empire, draped in glory and triumph, hid beneath its laurel crowns a darkness that few dared to confront. Its streets echoed with the chants of victory, but the silent cries of its youngest citizens were buried beneath marble columns and the roar of legionnaires. This is the forgotten story of how Rome, through law, superstition, cruelty, and power, systematically destroyed its own children in the earliest days of the Republic. Long before Caesar declared himself dictator, for life, Roman society already had brutal expectations for its offspring. A newborn's fate was not determined by gods or chance, it was decided by the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. If he chose to raise the child, the baby was kept. If not, the infant was cast aside, exposed to the elements to die. Alone, no one questioned it. The killing of unwanted babies wasn't murder, it was duty, the campus martis. Once a sacred field of military training, became a dumping ground for exposed infants. Wrapped in rags, some babies still had their umbilical cords attached when left at crossroads or temple steps. Wild dogs and scavenger birds knew the routine. Even more chilling, some infants were collected, not for mercy, but for slavery. Worse, exploitation in underground Roman brothels and blood sport arenas. Why would a society so proud of its civilization abandon its own flesh? The reasons were numerous and heartless. Children born with deformities were seen as omens, cursed by the gods. Girls seen as financial burdens without dowries were the most frequently discarded. Even perfectly healthy babies could be sentenced to die if their family was too poor, too ambitious, or simply indifferent. Rome's greatness, it seemed, was built on the bones of its own young. In the hidden rooms beneath the Palatine Hill, whispered conversations of noble families revealed another truth. Unwanted children were liabilities in political games, legitimate. Sons from forbidden affairs, daughters conceived in scandal, or heirs who stood in the way of ambition, many were smothered at birth or quietly poisoned before their names were ever recorded. Their erasure was total. Not even the scribes would dare inscribe their names. One of the darkest legal practices was the enforcement of expositio, the formal abandonment of a child. Unlike secretive infanticide, this practice was legalized and common. If a midwife presented the child to the father and he refused to lift the infant in acceptance, it was considered unworthy of life. Roman law did not merely allow this, it encouraged it as a tool to purify the bloodline. Religious rites made it worse. At the Temple of Saturn, priests offered sacrifices to appease the gods during harsh winters or military failures. Children especially. Captured ones from enemy tribes were rumored to be buried alive beneath the foundation stones of new temples or bridges, thought to ensure their endurance. While the official histories deny this, archaeological findings of small skeletons beneath, certain altars cast a grim shadow over Rome's rituals. Children who survived abandonment did not escape cruelty. Many were sold into slavery before they could walk. Little boys were trained to fight in mock gladiator contests for the amusement of drunken elites. Some children were sent to Mind's black holes of suffering where most died before adolescence. The empire devoured them for profit, never once acknowledging their stolen futures. Girls faced a different horror. Often sold before their first menstruation, they were raised in brothels, not homes. The brothels of Suburata, seediest part of Rome, overflowed with the sounds of suffering. There was no rescue. The law protected property, not people. And these girls, even as children, were nothing more than property. The emperors themselves were not innocent. Augustus, celebrated as a moral reformer, exiled his own daughter Julia for supposed indecency. Her children vanished from history. Nero's paranoia led to the murder of his young stepbrother Britannicus, poisoned during a feast. Commodus, obsessed with godhood, forced child gladiators to fight wild beasts for spectacle, laughing as they bled in the Colosseum. Even the noble idea of adoption in Rome seen as a method of political alliance was corrupted. Adopted sons were often tools, discarded once their usefulness waned. And Tiberius was adopted by Augustus, only to suffer years of exile and suspicion. Behind every great man in Rome stood the graves of boys who had once been heirs. The Roman education system, often praised, was another instrument of abuse. Boys from wealthy families were beaten mercilessly by their tutors. Discipline was expected, but it often crossed into torture. Those who failed to learn quickly were whipped, starved, or locked in basements for days. The cruelty was masked as preparation for life in the Senate or the legions. Children of slaves had no legal personhood. They were born into ownership. A slave woman who gave birth had no say in her child's fate. Masters could sell the baby on a whim, regardless of the mother's pleas. These children, branded and auctioned like cattle, were spread across the empire from Hispania to Syria, raising no more concern than livestock. Roman entertainment turned the suffering of children into sport. During public executions, children of condemned criminals were sometimes paraded before the crowd, then slaughtered to complete the spectacle. Mercy was rare. Justice was entertainment. One such case recorded the death of an 11-year-old boy accused of aiding a runaway slave. He was burned alive as the crowd jeered. Rome's elite collected children from conquered lands like trophies. Young boys from Gaul or Judea were paraded in triumphs, chained and crying, or mutilated to serve as palace eunuchs. Others were given as gifts to senators and generals. Their names were changed, their languages beaten out of them. They were expected to serve without question or suffer the whip. And through all of this, the Roman Senate never intervened. The empire wrote laws to manage trade routes, coinage, and military conquests, but never to protect children. Rome's obsession with power demanded sacrifice. Who better to sacrifice than those who could not resist? All Rome's forums buzzed with the debates of senators and the triumphs of generals. The voices of its children, those who remained alive, were silenced under the weight of fear. The empire did not merely tolerate violence against the young, it institutionalized it. It made it part of daily life, draping cruelty in the fabric of tradition, law, and discipline. In the countryside villas of wealthy patricians, children raised as servants or entertainers endured torment disguised as refinement. Young flute players and dancers were expected to perform for hours without error. A misnote or a falter in rhythm earned them lashes or days in the cold. The wealthy considered this acceptable, training the spirit, they called it. But the scars ran deep, and many of these children never lived to adulthood. The imperial orphanages, touted as sanctuaries by the emperors, were hardly better. Placed under the care of bureaucrats or clergy, these institutions were riddled with neglect. Food was scarce, medicine non-existent, and abuse routine. Orphan girls were married off as young as 9 to older Roman men in political exchange. Boys were conscripted into menial labor, with some forced into military service before they reached puberty. One chilling decree by Emperor Trajan allowed the castration of male child slaves without punishment if it could be proven the boy was being prepared for religious service or entertainment. Temples and amphitheaters began requesting eunuchs with alarming frequency. Some priests claimed it brought the child closer to the divine. But the truth was more brutal. Rome wanted control, and robbing a boy of his manhood ensured lifelong obedience. Public schools in Rome were battlegrounds in their own right. Poor children, those lucky enough to attend, were subjected to harsh conditions. Corporal punishment was a tool of pedagogy. A mispronounced Latin word could mean bruised knuckles. Failure in recitation meant standing for hours in silence under the sun. Teachers carried rods and birch branches as much as scrolls. Learning came through fear, not curiosity. Even among the aristocracy, family life was far from gentle. Fathers rarely showed affection. Sons were beaten to toughen them. Daughters were rarely educated, trained instead to be obedient wives before they were even teenagers. Family honor outweighed love. A daughter suspected of dishonor could be legally killed by her father. Honor killing was not just legal, it was expected. One disturbing practice during Rome's wars was the use of child messengers. These boys, sometimes as young as 7, were sent across enemy lines, carrying deceptive messages to mislead or delay opposing armies. They were expendable. Captured children were tortured for information or executed publicly to demoralize Roman forces. Rome accepted this as a cost of strategy. The cult of Mithras, one of many mystery religions in the empire, had attracted male-only devotees, including soldiers and officials. Among its secretive rites were rumors of child sacrifices. ritual cleansing of impure youth to appease Mithras during times of famine or unrest. Though hidden from public records, references in underground murals and obscure letters hint at this forbidden practice. Roman art and literature occasionally revealed society's darker truths. The poet Juvenal wrote of households where stepmothers poisoned their husbands' children to secure inheritance for their own offspring. Such stories were not fantasy. They were reflections of a society where ambition often outranked humanity. Roman playwrights joked about the deaths of unwanted babies, cloaking real horror in satire. Perhaps most tragic were the stories of children born to prisoners of war. These children were doubly cursed, born of raped women during conquest, raised as bastards, and denied citizenship. The state ignored them. Many were enslaved, others slaughtered to prevent future rebellion. The state saw them not as people, but as threats to the purity of Roman bloodlines. The Colosseum, symbol of Roman grandeur, holds secrets darker than mere gladiatorial battles. While adult warriors fought lions and tigers to amuse the mob, children, too, were forced into the arena. During special festivals, condemned families were executed together, husbands made to fight. While their wives and children were burned or mutilated before their eyes, these spectacles were advertised as divine justice. It's meant to cleanse Rome of treachery. In the outer provinces, governors adopted the same brutal logic. In North Africa, children accused of witchcraft were buried alive. In Britannia, Druid children were hunted down and crucified to erase resistance culture. The empire exported its cruelty alongside its roads and aqueducts. To conquer meant to control the next generation. And to do that, Rome believed it had to break the children. Roman medical practices did no favors either. Pediatric care was virtually non-existent. Illness in children was seen as divine punishment or bad fortune.
Doctors rarely intervened.
Bloodletting was applied indiscriminately. Tooth extraction was done with iron hooks. Children with epilepsy were often exorcised instead of treated, sometimes left to convulse in isolation until they died of exhaustion. Among the elite, children were political currency. Augustus adopted Tiberius, not out of love, but to secure the line of succession. Other children, especially those of rivals, were exiled, disfigured, or simply disappeared. The closer a child was to the imperial palace, the greater the danger. Innocence offered no protection in the shadow of the throne. The psychological toll was immense. Though ancient Rome had no language for trauma, children grew into broken men and women, perpetuating the same cruelty onto their own offspring. Generational. Trauma was passed not through memory, but through normalized violence. Rome raised its children to serve the state, and if they could not serve, they were discarded. Despite all this, some children survived and resisted. In the underground catacombs, early Christians protected orphan children. In Jewish communities across Judea, rabbis hid infants from Roman raids. Rebel slave camps in the Apennines taught children to read, to farm, and to hope. But these lights were rare in a vast empire of silence. Rome celebrated itself as the cradle of civilization. Yet in its homes, its temples, its amphitheaters, and its schools, it systematically extinguished the voices of those least able to defend themselves. The empire's greatness was not built by children, but on top of their graves. In the deepest corners of the Roman psyche, a terrifying contradiction took root. Children were symbols of the future, yet they were treated as disposable burdens. In the present, this tension rippled through every stratum of society, from the humblest slave dwellings to the gilded palaces of emperors. The result was a civilization that polished its marble statues, while leaving the most vulnerable to rot. Religious festivals like the Lupercalia began as rites of purification and fertility, but they often spiraled into public beatings. During this celebration, boys were stripped and whipped with goatskin thongs to supposedly cleanse the city of evil and promote childbirth among women. These boys, some no older than 6 or 7, were reduced to trembling spectacles for public amusement. The same society that feared childbearing among slaves found entertainment in brutalizing freeborn youth in the name of tradition. In the wealthiest homes, Young boys were chosen to serve as cupbearers, errand runners, and personal attendants. To their masters, these roles were painted as privileges, but in reality, they exposed children to near-constant danger, physical, emotional, and often sexual. A beautiful boy with curly hair and olive skin could attract unwanted attention from powerful men, particularly in households where lust and status were deeply entwined. Roman law made almost no distinction between children and adults when it came to punishment. A child accused of theft, for example, could be publicly flogged or enslaved for life. The 12 Tables Rome's foundational legal code for little protection for minors. Guilt was determined not by age, but by the powerlessness of the accused. Children were punished not to rehabilitate them, but to make examples of them. Girls bore the brunt of cultural expectations before they were even old enough to understand them. A Roman girl could be married by the age of 12. Dowries were arranged when she was still playing with wooden dolls. Her value was measured in her ability to bear sons and manage a household. Anything beyond that was considered rebellion. If she resisted marriage or showed signs of independence, she was often confined to her home or handed over to religious institutions that demanded silence and obedience. Behind the doors of Rome's many temples, some of the darkest abuses remained hidden. Vestal virgins, chosen between the ages of 6 and 10, were taken from their families and forbidden from contact with the outside world. Though venerated publicly, they lived under constant threat. If they broke their vow of chastity, they were buried alive as punishment. One girl, only 13, was sealed in a chamber beneath the city and left to die with a single loaf of bread and a flickering oil lamp. Her name was erased from the records, but her fate haunted whispers in Rome for decades. Rome's obsession with legacy twisted family dynamics. Fathers often arranged duels between sons to determine which was more worthy of inheritance or honor. These duels were framed as games, but they sometimes ended in bloodshed. Mothers were rarely allowed to interfere. In the eyes of the state, her role was to produce heirs and then step aside. The military, one of Rome's proudest institutions, played its part in exploiting children, too. Boys from poor families were sometimes taken as pure militium boys of the army, serving as squires or mascots for legions. These boys marched thousands of miles, slept in tents beside hardened soldiers, and were expected to perform menial labor in dangerous zones. When battles came, they were not protected, they were forgotten. Rome's insatiable demand for labor also led to the rise of familia rustica, rural slave farms where entire families, including children, worked the fields. Infants born in these farms rarely saw their second year. The work was grueling, the food minimal, and diseases rampant. If a child grew old enough to walk, they were put to work in the fields or stables. These were not children, they were economic units. One of the most horrifying practices was damnatio memoria, the erasure of a person from public record. Children born to traitors or disgraced families were often victims. Their names were chiseled off monuments, their portraits defaced, their birthdays unmarked. It was a fate worse than death to be made invisible in both life and history. Rome did not simply kill its children, it made them vanish. Those who managed to rise from the ashes of this cruelty often bore deep psychological scars. Some grew into tyrants, repeating the brutality they endured. Others became zealots or rebels, rejecting the empire altogether. A few escaped into the burgeoning Christian communities, where compassion, though rare and persecuted, still flickered. These children told their stories in catacombs and whispered psalms, preserving a version of Rome that history books refused to write. Roman medical writers like Galen and Celsus wrote of children as undeveloped vessels, prone to error and deserving of strict correction. Their advice on parenting included beating, shaming, and controlling diet as punishment. Childhood was seen not as a protected phase of life, but as a disorder to be disciplined into submission. In Rome's art, children were idealized cherubic, figures sculpted in marble, depicted with serene faces and playful poses. But these images were lies. They masked a society that devoured its own youth. The real children of Rome, the hungry, the abused, The mutilated left, no statues behind. Their bones were buried without names, their stories told only through fragments and shadows. Even in death, Roman children found no peace. In mass graves across the empire, archaeologists have discovered the skeletons of children buried in pits, sometimes with signs of trauma, fractured skulls, broken ribs, signs of strangulation. Some were buried with dog bones, perhaps as part of a ritual, or perhaps as a cruel reminder that they were no more valued than animals. Despite this, hope endured. In the quiet corners of the empire, stories survived. A mother in Pompeii etched her lost daughter's name into a wall before the volcanic ash covered her home. A Christian scribe in Antioch recorded the rescue of orphaned boys during a famine. A Jewish elder in Alexandria taught his grandchildren to read Hebrew, defying Roman bans. These were acts of rebellion, small flames against a roaring inferno. And yet, for every child who escaped, hundreds perished. Rome kept building. Columns rose, roads stretched. Emperors came and went. But beneath it all, the bones of Rome's forgotten children remained, silent witnesses to a legacy of greatness built upon their suffering. Rome's brutality toward children was not an accident of history, it was policy. It was deeply embedded in a society that placed obedience, discipline, and imperial pride above compassion or protection. With every conquest, Rome expanded not only its borders, but also the reach of its systemic cruelty toward the innocent. When Rome conquered Carthage, it razed the city to ash. But in the ruins, it spared the youngest boys under 10 and girls under 12, not out of mercy, but because they were more pliable slaves. These children were shackled and transported across the Mediterranean to be sold in Roman markets. They had witnessed the destruction of their families and cities, and now they were expected to serve the very people who destroyed them. Their cries meant nothing. Their tears were foreign. On the island of Delos, one of the empire's largest slave markets, children were frequently auctioned by the dozens. Sellers called out their ages like weights. Boy, 6 summers. Girl, barely 10, already trained to serve. Some were stripped and prodded like livestock. Wealthy buyers from Rome's elite homes inspected their teeth, their limbs, their posture. If a child flinched, they were considered disobedient. If they were too quiet, they were labeled defective. It was commerce at its coldest. Some of the youngest were taken to serve in elite Roman households as pure delicatus, a term meaning delicate boy. These children were selected for their beauty and charm and were used not for labor, but for pleasure and spectacle. The Senate ignored these practices. The law turned away. They were too profitable, too socially entrenched to confront. Velvet curtains and mosaic-covered floors. Innocence was routinely shattered. In rural towns far from Rome, Roman tax collectors exacted payments in coin, goods, and occasionally people. When families couldn't pay, children were taken as collateral. A father's debt could condemn his son to a lifetime of servitude in a Roman mine. Girls were sent to textile workshops that functioned more like prisons. There were no inquiries, no reviews, only ledgers marked paid in full. Even literature celebrated sacrifice in the name of state loyalty. The tale of Lucius Junius Brutus, who executed his own sons for conspiring against the Republic, was told with admiration. The message to all fathers was clear. If your children threaten Rome, even in thought, they must die. Patriotism was purified through blood. Even if that blood was your own lineage, philosophers like Seneca spoke eloquently of virtue and restraint. Yet even he once suggested that infants born deformed should be drowned. Stoicism preached endurance, not empathy. In the elite circles of Roman thought, compassion was weakness, mercy a deviation. Children were to be shaped or removed, while Roman citizens sometimes showed quiet affection toward their offspring. Even those moments were laced with fear. Infant mortality was so high that many families refused to name a child until it survived its first year. Funerary inscriptions, like "To my sweet son, who lived 3 weeks," the countryside graves. Love was conditional. Bonds were cautious. Hope was dangerous. Roman mythology, too, reflected this cultural disregard for youth. Saturn, the ancient god of time, devoured his own children to protect his power, a metaphor that mirrored the very state that worshipped him. The myths reinforced the message. Children are threats to power, unless controlled or consumed. In training for the priesthood, young boys endured rigid, often humiliating routines. Those who served in augury or haruspicide interpretation of omens were required to fast for days, sleep on stone, and witness animal sacrifices at close range. The exposure to gore and death began early. Desensitization was considered a virtue, and these rituals were seen as an initiation into Roman masculinity. Children of entertainers, gladiators, acrobats, and traveling musicians lived precariously. If their parents fell out of favor or failed to entertain, the whole family could be enslaved. Some children were thrown into acts themselves, walking tightropes, performing stunts in public squares, or playing instruments for coins. When they stumbled, they were beaten not just by their handlers, but sometimes by crowds seeking amusement through cruelty. In Rome's darkest corners, forbidden cults and mystery religions sometimes demanded child offerings. Archaeological evidence in some Etruscan and early Roman sites has revealed small altars with charred bones and miniature sarcophagi. Though official histories deny these rituals, the layers of ash and bone tell a different story. Sacrifice was not myth, it was practice. The Roman census, updated every 5 years, counted citizens, soldiers, slaves, but never orphans. They were invisible to the state. No names, no homes, no protections. Orphans roamed the streets of Rome, in bands, stealing bread, fighting over scraps, sometimes forming temporary alliances for survival. Most died young. Some were caught and forced into state labor or the Navy's galley ships, where they rode until they collapsed, unburied and forgotten. In the provinces, the children of defeated tribes became targets for Romanization. Languages were banned, their stories erased. In Gaul, Dacia, and Judea, Roman governors burned local texts and installed Latin-only schools. Native children were punished for speaking their mother tongue. Cultural extermination was state policy, and children were the first to be reprogrammed or erased. Despite this, some families fought back. Jewish mothers taught Torah in whispered chants beneath moonlight. Celtic elders shared legends with their grandchildren around fire pits far from Roman ears. In Christian catacombs, hidden schools taught children to read scripture, knowing that penalty was death. These were quiet revolutions, acts of love in defiance of empire. The Emperor Domitian, paranoid and brutal, reportedly had child performers whipped for minor mistakes during palace dinners. He laughed as they cried. His guests followed suit, not daring to show discomfort. Imperial court became a theater of terror, where even a child's pain was politicized. Rome wrote thousands of laws regarding trade, building codes, inheritance, and taxes, but never did it draft a bill to safeguard its children. The young were protected only if they were heirs, male and useful. All others were expendable collateral in an empire drunk on conquest and ambition. The marble pillars of Rome still stand in museums across the world, symbols of grandeur and civilization. But beneath their surface lies the truth, that the greatest empire in the ancient world was built with hands too small to carry swords, on backs too soft to bear whips. Rome did not simply neglect its children, it weaponized them, destroyed them, and then buried the evidence beneath centuries of glory in the twilight of the empire. As corruption bloated the Senate and enemies massed along the frontiers, Rome's cruelty toward its children only deepened. With resources stretched thin, children in the provinces were rounded up by military officers to replenish dwindling ranks. Some were as young as 10, armed with spears they could barely lift. They were not expected to survive, only to delay the enemy. The empire fed its children to war like grain to fire. Even as Rome crumbled, it refused to spare its young. And when the final collapse came, the silence of its missing children echoed loudest of all.